There we go. We'll just do this. Okay, we'll do this and hope for the best. What I want to start talking about today, and I apologize, this is a little, I don't know why it came out so blurry, but what I want to talk about today is the impact of the First World War. Now, truly, we're going to be talking about the impact of the First World War over the next 2 weeks, because the First World War will have disparate impacts in different places. In Germany, in Japan, in Britain, in France, in the United States, in the Soviet Union. But I want to touch on a few things today to help us sort of understand the mindset, the political, the economic, and you might say the socio-cultural environment that exists in the world between the First World War and the Second World War. The First World War, remember, was called by many the Great War, the war to end all wars. They had no idea what was coming. It was not called World War I. Until, of course, World War II came along. So for many people, the experience of 1914 to 1918 seemed to them to be a once-in-a-lifetime, a once-in-a-millennium sort of experience. And I want to understand a little bit how that understanding comes about, and then talk about some of the ramifications that people saw, or some of the results that people saw out of this war. I put up this recruiting poster from 1915 in Britain. The army isn't all work. That is, you've got soldier here, but you've got a cricket player here and a soccer player here. The idea being that the army is just like joining another team, just like being on another team. It's like a game. It's like a sport. And in some ways, this represents the initial feeling that many in Europe had, and on the eve of and at the start of the First World War, that they were embarking on a sort of grand adventure. That war was not nasty and brutal and painful and messy, but rather that war was, in some sense, a glorious adventure. Yes, you might die, but if you died, you'd die gloriously. You'd die heroically. You have a generation in Europe which, apart from the Russians, more on them to come, had not really seen a major military conflict in the previous 20 to 35 years. What you had seen were colonial conflicts. The British, the French, even the Italians, who in 1896 managed to lose to the Ethiopians. You have people's ideas of war predicated on these sort of very short, very sort of unequal encounters. The European armies or European-led armies equipped with modern machinery, machine guns, automatic weaponry, things like that, could wipe out small groups of natives, even large groups of natives, really easily. And so there's a sense going into war in 1914, not only that this war is going to be over quickly, it'll be over by Christmas, some people thought, but there's also this idea that war is sort of painless. That war is not something that's going to drag on forever. That yes, there are risks associated with war, but it's more of sort of a grand adventure. There's a writer who talks about a moment in early 1915 when, sort of embodying this, a British officer led a charge out of a trench in northern France by kicking a rugby ball forward. Sort of, let's go and get it. He was immediately riddled with bullets and died. And so perhaps the message was lost on his men. But this idea, the army isn't all work. By 1916, the British government has to give up this idea of trying to get people to enlist. And they start going into the posters of, I want you, pointing directly at you. And then they introduce the draft and actually conscript people by the end of 1916. So you have, in the first place, a war that starts with a fundamental misunderstanding of war. Or at least with a fundamental misconception of what war will be like in the early 20th century. As I said, the only group that you might say had a more realistic view of this were Russian soldiers. Russians had fought, thousands of Russians had died in both a land and sea war with the Japanese in 1904 and 1905. And Russian soldiers understood that really the basic fighting philosophy of the Russian General Staff was, we have lots of Russians. Didn't really extend much further than that. The idea being that you can always, and you will always, be able to throw more Russians at the problem. So the sort of fatalistic approach, you might say, on the Russian side. But elsewhere in the war, there was this idea that you were heading off into sort of a glorious adventure. This changes quickly over the course of the war for a couple of reasons. The first is this. You have, in the First World War, millions of people mobilized, millions injured, millions killed. If you look, for example, here, you see that the Germans and the Russians both suffer significant casualties, significant fatalities, both just around 2 million in terms of deaths. The remarkable thing there is that the Russians accumulated those 2 million deaths in a much shorter time than the Germans did. That is, the Russian Revolution that begins in early 1917, in many ways, brings a lot of the Russian army to a halt for the fighting. So it gives you an idea here that it took them less time to accumulate what's basically sort of this, a similar sort of mortality rate or number killed in action. You have as I said, staggering numbers mobilized, and you've got, for the time, and really for any time, an enormous number killed and wounded. That is, you've got, again, around 1.9 million for the Germans and the Russians, the French about 1.2 million, the British just under 1 million. You have casualties on a scale previously unseen in Europe. And it's not simply the number of casualties that are important, that is, killed and wounded. It's the staggering intensity of it. In 1916, on July 1st, at a place called the Somme, the British Army lost 60,000 men on the first day, 1/3 of whom were killed. So 20,000 deaths on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. And there have been a variety of explanations for why there's such a level of casualties and why there's such sort of shock at the level of casualties. And we'll come to that, but I just want to start by saying that there's these rather sort of staggering numbers out there. You have mixed in here not only the number dead, but you have really 10, possibly 12 million wounded at the end of the war. You have, at the end of this war, this picture. Disabled veterans throughout the world, but particularly in Europe. Disabled, unemployed, impoverished veterans. And you have people whose injuries are more traumatic than anyone could possibly have imagined. One of the things about this war is that this war, as all wars do, ultimately creates new ways to kill and to maim and to injure other people. This war is going to see the rapid expansion of automatic weaponry, the refinement of artillery and mines, ultimately the use of tanks, the use of poison gas. You have people with all sorts of injuries, some of which can be seen, some of which can't be seen. One of the things that's very interesting is that over the course of the 20th century, as medicine becomes more advanced, especially battlefield combat medicine becomes more advanced, more people survive what had previously been fatal injuries. They then come home, where in many cases there is shock at the extent of these injuries. The casualty figures for the war run through the mid-1920s because there were people who died of their wounds, but who remained alive at the end of the war, but eventually succumbed in 1919, 20, 21. You have people who are amputees, people who are major burn victims, people whose lungs have been destroyed, or have been whose eyes have been destroyed by poison gas. And you've got an entire group of people, suffering from what at the time will be called shell shock. People who physically seem fine, but psychologically are significantly disabled by what they've seen and what they've lived through. This is something that happens, is not new to this, to this war, but the scale of it, again, on such a scale that it has to be investigated, is something that's new. During the war, there will not be a lot of recognition of this shell shock, only towards the end of the war. The British Army will execute about 300 soldiers for cowardice or desertion during the war. Usually people who had already fought in something like the Somme or other major engagements, but then refused, were physically unable, attempted to escape from further combat. And they were hauled up before courts-martial and shot. Just about all of them have now been pardoned. I mean, it doesn't really do much for them, I suppose. Over the last 10 years by the British government, it's gone back and reinvestigated all of these cases and concluded that, by and large, these are people who had fought bravely before, but had reached a certain limit or had seen and experienced something that rendered them incapable, psychologically, mentally, physically even, of going forward again. But at the time, it's only at the end of the war that people are beginning to develop this idea of shell shock. But it's going to become so, it's going to take hold with real sort of import by the end of the 1930s. But this is another way in which people can be injured during the war. The Second World War, the British Army will not execute anyone for cowardice or desertion. The American Army, maybe one. But it's, again, a demonstration of the fact that, General Patton's views notwithstanding, there was a general acceptance that war was psychologically disabling and that war could cause injuries, even injuries that could not be seen. So it's a war that creates massive numbers of casualties. It creates them, as I've mentioned, through experiences and through engagements with weaponry that had previously been unimagined, or at least only sort of theoretically imagined. It's a war which is, especially in Europe, surreal. And I don't use that word sort of offhandedly. That is, it's surreal. People see things in this war, not just in terms of death and carnage and chaos, but you have images, for example, like this. This is a man wearing a gas mask next to a horse wearing a gas mask. In many ways, this epitomizes a lot of the war. That is, this is a war in which, in the first place, people don't look like they imagine soldiers would. People are fighting in conditions they can't imagine. The poet Wilfred Owen, who lived through several gas attacks, talked about, especially in chlorine gas attacks, sort of the air turning green around them. Mustard gas tended to blind or to corrode your lungs. That moved on very quickly to chlorine gas, which actually acts directly on your nervous system and basically causes it to shut down. You almost sort of drown internally. This is surreal. That something like this would come sort of looming out of the fog at you. You have the other thing here, and something that historians have talked about a lot in the First World War, which is the fact you got the horse here. The First World War is this uncomfortable combination, you might say, of very modern ways of, or very modern sort of mechanics, very modern weapons, and much less modern strategies and approaches to fighting. That is automatic weaponry, the use of artillery, the use of gas shells, ultimately the use of tanks and aircraft, all seem to come about without a corresponding increase in strategic or tactical thinking about how they might be used. That there was among the general staff in many of the combatant countries a reluctance to fully embrace technology or to trust technology. And there were catastrophic accidents. First time the British used gas. Basically, they got the weather report wrong, and the gas blew back on all their advancing soldiers. You had generals who didn't trust artillery to provide covering fire. So they would simply load up an artillery barrage for 24 hours against German positions and then stop, because they didn't want to keep shelling while soldiers advanced towards the position. All the Germans realized is, let's just survive the barrage and then we'll get out and fire. So they dug deep bunkers, they dug deep trenches, fortified themselves. It was a sort of this combination of tactical inflexibility, tactical, almost sort of, out-of-date tactical approaches combined with very up-to-date weapons technology. So you have these images, people wearing gas masks. You have, for example, the American painter, John Singer Sargent. This is one of the most famous images to come out of the war, depicting people who've been blinded by gas. You also have situations like this. This is from 1915. This is a British poster urging people to enlist. It's perhaps the most British poster ever because it says, enlist by staying at home, you are giving your approval to this kind of thing. Fairly wordy. And what they're talking about approving, or giving your approval to, is the use of Zeppelins. The Germans bombed London. Not very much, and not like they would 20 years later, but they bombed London, almost literally dropping explosives out of these airships. It seemed like something out of H.G. Wells. That is, you have this notion of sort of, death from above. The idea that aerial bombing, we're going to talk a lot more about that in the next few weeks, was this unstoppable force. But it's also this idea here that's presented in this poster that it's sort of unsportsmanlike to use Zeppelins. But it is, again, surreal. It's also doing something else, and this is something that I mentioned last time, which is that it is beginning to erode the distinction between civilian and combatant life. And even today in London, you can see various markers of things like these Zeppelin raids. This is a school in the East End of London, and then the plaque that was erected for it. So again, it's a war which people had sort of no conception what this is going to be like. They had no idea. One literary historian has looked at the war, and he said that the First World War, ultimately, the way in which people talk about it, becomes dominated by the idea of irony. Classical irony, which is the idea that expectations do not meet reality, or I should rephrase that reality fails to live up to expectations. What you expect and what actually happens are two different things. And that feeling, when faced with that predicament, is one of irony. The failure of life to live up to your expectations. One other element about the war, rather briefly, in this sense of how shocking it is, and then I want to talk about the concept of historiography, which I asked you all to think about last time. One other concept is this. This is a war which ultimately requires people to think of new ways of commemorating the dead. That is, it is the First World War that ultimately invents what is now, in many countries, the common practice of memorializing an unknown soldier. That is, there was a large proportion of soldiers who went off to this war who didn't come back alive and who also didn't come back dead. That is, the way in which the war was fought, the conditions, the weaponry, meant that people didn't just die, people disappeared. Bodily disappearance. There was nothing for their parents, friends, spouses, etc. to bury, to grieve over, to visit. And there is a lot of public pressure, especially in Britain and in France, to some degree in the United States, to find a way to provide a grave for those people. This is something that had never been really encountered before. Yes, people had disappeared in major conflicts before, but never in these numbers. Never had you had this situation of people just basically disappearing into the mud, in the deserts of the Middle East, in ships that were torpedoed in the North Atlantic. You have this real sort of public clamor. And in 1920, the British create this. This is the first Tomb of the Unknowns. It's going to be very quickly copied by the French, the Belgians, the Canadians, the Australians, and even the Americans. That you have a very public desire, and one that is expressed in the million people who come visit this. In the first couple of months that it's open in Westminster Abbey in 1920. That this becomes this almost sort of sacred site, and it becomes a sort of substitute grave for people, a substitute tomb. It's something which is probably no longer possible. That is, the First and Second World War have unknown soldier memorials in many of these countries, but since then, advances in DNA identification technology, things like that, advances in medicine, advances in body armor, all these sorts of things have meant that it is much harder now to actually have an unknown soldier. But in the First World War, this is sort of emblematic. People went and they disappeared. And what they found, in essence, was that what they ultimately did was, for example, in the British case, they exhumed remains from unmarked graves. People who have been buried unidentified. They literally placed those remains, or several sorts of remains, several sets of remains, in a room and had someone blindfolded pick which one would be in the grave. The others to be reburied in military cemeteries in Britain and France. So you have, again, this sense that the war has turned out catastrophically. It's a sense that's held very strongly by the so-called victorious powers, the people who won. These populations really regard the war with great horror as something that must never be replicated, something that must never happen again. And it's due to, again, this sort of shock, the Tomb of the Unknowns. It's felt much less. What's interesting is that in a place like Germany, where this is viewed as a by some as a catastrophic defeat, there's a division. There's people who want to mourn, and there's also people who want revenge. We'll be talking about the revenge people, but this is one of the few public artistic statements by the Germans in the 1920s. This is by a sculptor, a woman named Katie Kollwitz, and this is at a German cemetery in Belgium. Still there. It's called The Grieving Parents. Germany doesn't have a Tomb of the Unknown, mostly because the Nazis created a Tomb of the Unknown in the early 1930s. It was destroyed during the war, and no one wants to go back and sort of try and memorialize a German soldier from either World War. Now, what they do have in Berlin, or what they did have in East Berlin, in the former East Germany, was a memorial to the victims of all war, which was the way in which they sort of kept the idea of an unknown, but not specifically German. But this is one of the sort of more profound. It's again a cemetery where there is no triumphalism. There are other cemeteries in Belgium and France, British, Canadian, Australian, that are a little bit more sort of triumphal, that have arches, that are sort of a little bit more impressive. The German one is very muted, and this is sort of the dominant tone set in the German one. So you have, at the end of the war, a profound discomfort, to say the least, with how war is fought and what war means. And what I want to start talking about now is how people interpret the war. But on the topic of interpretation, before I go any further, I want to talk or ask you a little bit about that concept I mentioned last time, and I was going to ask you all to go and look up and think about a little bit, because this is very important for this course. Historiography. What is historiography? Who wishes to snap?
The story of the study of historical writing.
The state of historical writing?
Mm-hmm.
Meaning what?
It's the study of someone looking at what somebody else wrote about history and how those ideas have changed.
Yes, it's the study, you might say, it's the study of history. It's the history of history, in some ways. How have people interpreted events before, and how do they interpret them now? Right?
I was just going to add to the method. Basically, you're studying the method, how they studied it.
Yeah, you can study both the interpretations and the methodologies. Good point. That is, you have, within historical analysis, you have conclusions, and then you have different methodologies to reach those conclusions. Do you study statistics? Do you study demographics? Do you study economic history? Do you study sort of cultural representations and what they mean for history? So yes, so this is one thing I want to just keep in mind real quick. Historiography, it's the continued, you might say, sort of recognition that history is not entirely settled. That is, yes, we know certain events happened in the past. We know there was a Second World War. But within the Second World War, there remain lots of questions. Why did something happen? That's the big thing in historiography. Why did something happen? That's something that historians continue to argue about. Historiography depends on people the review of historiography, of how people resolve historical controversies, looks at the methods that people use, the evidence that people use, the arguments and the structure of the arguments that people use. So this is something I want you to keep in mind, because a lot of what we'll be talking about in the course is how historians have interpreted certain events, and how and why we ought to look at those interpretations, as well as look at, quote-unquote, the facts. Look at the background information. So this is something, when I talk, for example, about one of those scholars saying that the dominant sort of mode of discourse after the First World War is irony, in some ways that's a historiographical point. Because others have said, no, it's not irony. There's a much more sort of patriotic feeling in parts of the world. There's not this sort of reluctance to give up. Or there is, you might say, sort of a reluctance to give up war. Or there is less of a sense of sort of, dismay than others may argue. And it comes down to evidence. It comes down to how you use the evidence, how you structure it. So remember this, that is that historical, quote-unquote, truths are very hard to get at. Historical truths in the sense of not knowing simply what happened, but why it happened. Even understanding the sequence in which things happened. The how of things. So keep these in mind. This concept of historiography is very important. And it's something that I'm going to be asking you to look at in the paper you write. To look at how a particular episode within this war, a particular development, event, trend, or theme in this war, how that is treated historically. As I said, I'll be passing out probably next week some more sort of direct instructions on how to do this particular paper assignment. But keep in mind this: historiography is the recognition, basically, that historians interpret events differently. They don't disagree whether something happened, for the most part, although they may at times. What they do disagree about is the why something happened. At times they may also disagree on how something happened, even perhaps on when something happened. So think of that. Keep that in mind. Thanks. Those are two good ideas, I think, going forward for historiography. What I want to do is talk about now reactions to the war, reactions to this massive conflict. I've already said that there is in, or among the victor powers, a sort of revulsion against war. That in the 1920s and the early 1930s, there are going to be, first of all, some very profound artistic and cultural reactions to the war. which combined with the actual impact, with what people have seen in the deaths of their relatives and friends, the severe sort of disfigurement of people, the mental, psychological, and physical disabilities people have incurred because of the war, there will be this real reluctance to think of war as a way of solving problems in the future. I'll just mention a few sort of artistic reactions, some of which you may be familiar with, some of which you may not. You've probably all heard of, if not actually read, Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front. Remarque himself was a German soldier. He only served briefly on the front lines, and it's a sort of fictionalized account of the war. But again, this idea of what is the usefulness of this sacrifice. You have Robert Graves, an Englishman, who writes a memoir called Goodbye to All That, basically talking about his pre-war and his post-war self. That in essence, the pre-war self has disappeared, destroyed in the war. That what he has seen in the war has fundamentally altered how he thinks about people, how he thinks about concepts like bravery and honor and courage. In the middle of the 1920s, the novelist Virginia Woolf will publish a short novel called Mrs. Dalloway, which traces a day in the life of an upper-class woman in London, but which contains a significant segment on shell shock. There is a character who ultimately will kill himself because he cannot get out of these, or cannot escape from the sort of psychological trauma that the war has caused. And you have various poets, Wilfred Owen, who dies right before the end of the war, who writes several poems that are subtle but scathing. Don't ever read anything by Wilfred Owen? Encountered anything by Wilfred Owen? No. The most famous one is called Dulce et Decorum Est. Does that sound familiar? It's from the Latin, the ancient Roman phrase of how sweet and proper it is to die for your country. And it's all about a gas attack. And he says, if you could see this, you wouldn't tell your children how sweet and proper, or how sweet and honorable it is to die. Siegfried Sassoon is, in fact, an Englishman himself, and he survives the war. He's a friend of Owen's, and he writes not subtly scathing poems. He writes diatribes against the generals, against everyone who stayed safely home in bed, as he says. The people who sort of don't understand the war, the people who have no appreciation of what the soldiers' experiences are out there. So there are all these sort of virulent reactions. And in the 1920s and 30s, in Britain and in France, there is a very strong and pronounced strain of public opinion which says war is not the answer. And it's something to which politicians must respond. It's not the only concern politicians will have about the utility or inutility of war. But there is real concern that the public does not want war. In the early 1930s, there will be significant polls taken, in Britain especially, which will show that the vast majority of the country does not want to go to war. Doesn't want to go to war over German rearmament. Doesn't want to go to war over German desires to annex part of Czechoslovakia. We'll talk about this more as we get to the case of Britain and the United States. But there is this real and developed sense that war is not a useful way of solving things. It's going to be something that will be apparent in the United States too, although there will be much more pragmatic. The idea will be, what did the United States get out of the war? In France and Britain, it's going to be more philosophical. That is, what did war do? What is the cost of war? What is the moral calculus involved in going to war? We'll talk about the German reaction next week, but the German reaction is, in essence, that among some, especially those who fought, is that we didn't actually lose the war. So among the victor powers is this sort of reluctance to go to war. But because of the way the war ends, among some of the losers, there is this enormous desire for revenge. So you have these artistic reactions. These are not all of them. One American one that deals again with the sort of the reaction to the war is by the author John Dos Passos, called 1919, which ends with his recreation of the interment of the American unknown soldier at Arlington National Cemetery, and his imagining of who that possibly could be. And he goes to this whole litany of who, where this person might have come from, what this person might have done, how this person might have lived. So again, you have these reactions. You have not only, you might say, sort of though, artistic or cultural reactions, which are important in swaying public sentiment. You also have the very visceral reactions to the deaths, to the idea that there are people missing and whose bodies will never be recovered, to the large number of people who are disabled. One thing that's going to become very important in many of these countries after the First World War is the rise of veterans associations. That is to argue that veterans are this group which can and should exert political pressure. That veterans have this sort of done their duty, and that there is a moral obligation owed to veterans. During the 1920s, you'll have organizations in Britain and in France pushing for greater access to health care, to jobs, to economic security for veterans, especially disabled veterans. In the 1930s, the early 1930s, you're going to have marches on Washington by unemployed veterans who will say that, does anyone know the bonus army? Has anyone encountered that in American history? In 1932, they march on Washington. Yeah, Herbert Hoover is still president at the time, and he orders troops to disperse American veterans from the Mall in Washington, from sort of central Washington. They were there to claim bonuses, which they were supposed to have been paid after a certain number of years, after their war service, but they now weren't going to be because the country's in the midst of a depression. So you have the creation of this idea of sort of veteran soldiers as people who occupy this not privileged, but distinct political position. People who have made sacrifices. People who have volunteered to sacrifice. And people who are therefore, in many senses, owed at least access to opportunity, access to employment, access to healthcare. If that's a sort of larger sort of mental and, I'd say almost sort of cultural reaction to the war, what I want to talk about now are just a couple of pragmatic reactions to the war, because these are going to be equally as important. And in the case of the Americans, in the case of sort of the more hard-headed political and economic and diplomatic thinkers after the war, these are going to be the things that they'll look back on the First World War. The First World War does change dramatically the map of Europe. Old empires disappear. That is, the Ottoman Empire shrinks down to what is now modern Turkey. The Russian Empire becomes, of course, the Soviet Union. The German Empire is destroyed and dismantled. The Austro-Hungarian Empire is destroyed or is dismantled, leaving all of these new states, like, for example, Hungary, Yugoslavia, a newly recreated Poland. You have a new map. And it's a map whose sort of development, whose political sort of existence is a cause for concern. There are some who look at this and say, what has war done? In the first place, war has broken up empires, which is a little bit of a concern to those who still wish to retain their empires, the French, the British, and to a lesser extent, the Americans. We need to be more specific than that, though. There's a couple of other things even more sort of relevant politically. The first is this. The First World War is tied in many people's minds to specifically what happens in Russia. The First World War, and historians largely agree on this, the First World War is the reason you get the Russian Revolution. The Russians are completely unprepared to fight in 1914. By 1917, they have massive casualties, massive disaffection within the ranks of ordinary soldiers. They have huge transport problems at home, huge problems for distribution of food, lack of resources both for civilians and for combatants. Soldiers being literally told, charge and try to find a rifle as you're going. Somebody else out there got killed. They must have something. This will be both in the First and the Second World War. And it cannot, I think, it's impossible to overstate just how much the specter of what happens in Russia in 1917 looms over how people react to this war in the 20s and 30s, and how they think about war in general. Because war has unleashed this force. It's unleashed Bolshevism. That is, you've got the execution of the Russian Tsar and his family. You've got the destruction of the Russian aristocracy. The prohibition of the Russian church. That for all of people, people who have been concerned about socialism and communism before, this now is their greatest fear come to life. A massive socialist revolution. One which is fundamentally transforming the Soviet Union. This causes a lot of people a lot of disquiet. That is the idea of a communist state, one in which the state runs the economy, in which the state controls just about all of the property, at least the industrial property, economic property, infrastructure. One in which religion is now not only sort of downgraded, but formally outlawed. In which property is confiscated from landowners and others. This is terrifying to people. 1920s, the early 1930s, in Britain, in France, in Germany, in the United States, in Italy, the fear of communism, the idea that, we talk about the Red Scare in this country coming after 1945. There's a very profound, you might say, sort of Red Scare in the early 1920s, in this country and elsewhere. People seeing communists and anarchists and socialists all in league together. And the one sort of example of this sort of moving out of the Soviet Union comes actually in January 1919 in Berlin. There is a fairly small and fairly localized, you might say, sort of Bolshevik or Bolshevik-style revolution. It's called the Spartacist uprising. After Spartacus. This is a poster supporting it from the Communist Party, the KPD, the German Communist Party, and it says, "Who was Spartacus?" Excuse me. What was Spartacus? And it shows again sort of the worker taking on the three sort of the multi-headed beast here. One is called Junkertum. That's the people who are the landowners, largely in Eastern Germany. You have the capital, or capitalism, and then you have the new militarism. So the Spartacists are taking on these three. The Spartacists are actually taken down, not by the state itself, the new German Republic, but by basically paramilitary groups organized by German veterans. They're called the Freikorps, F-R-E-I-K-O-R-P-S, the Freikorps. And they were basically organizations of German veterans who were banded together after the war because they didn't have jobs and they didn't know what to do. So they formed sort of paramilitary groups. And in January 1919, they took on the Spartacists in Berlin and crushed them. You have, therefore, in many people's minds, proof enough that the Bolshevik project is on the move, out of the Soviet Union into Germany. And people knew that this is what Lenin and Trotsky especially, in the Soviet government, in the Soviet command, that this is what their ideal was. The export of revolution. It wasn't going to stop in the Soviet Union. It was going to go worldwide. So you have this sense that war brings about significant social dislocation, political dislocation, one result of which can be the Bolsheviks. And as I said, it's impossible to overstate how important that is. That in the 1920s and 1930s, in France, in Britain, in the United States, other parts of Europe in particular, people will look at rising fascist movements, like Mussolini in Italy, like the German Nazis. And they will say, well, yes, we're not entirely comfortable with these people, but they're very much opposed to the communists. There's Mussolini and Hitler will both make no effort to hide. They make no effort to hide their hatred of communists and socialists. In both cases, Mussolini himself being, of course, a former socialist, the Nazis, of course, having technically socialism in their name, which has led lots of people today to conclude, not lots of people, lots of uninformed people to conclude that the Nazis were in fact socialists. It was called the National German Socialist Workers' Party, the National Socialist German Workers' Party. All that's really important there is German. Every other word doesn't really apply. But both Hitler and Mussolini make their mark internationally by declaring their opposition to socialism and communism by rounding up and either incarcerating or executing members of the communist and socialist parties, trade union organizers, left-wing journalists, and others. And it's one of the things that the war creates, in many people's minds, the instability in certain areas that allows for communism or Bolshevism to emerge. Therefore, war needs to be avoided. Not because war is bad per se, but because war can shake up a society to such a degree. And that the risk of going to war, therefore, is not simply loss of life, but the risk is of loss of an entire political system, an entire social and economic structure. So we have to understand this. It's not just people fundamentally opposed to war because of what they've seen during the war, but also people who say war is too dangerous. War produces Bolsheviks and things like that. Everyone with me so far? Okay, there's a couple of other things. The war causes enormous economic dislocation. And you can see, there's in several places you can see how the war creates this dislocation. For Britain in particular, the war is a financial disaster. Great Britain, before 1914, is the world's largest creditor nation. That is the British government, British banks, investment houses, and others. They have loaned more money to the rest of the world than anywhere else on the globe. The world's largest creditor nation. After 1918, Britain is the world's largest debtor nation. The British government has borrowed heavily, British banks have borrowed heavily, many of them from American banks and American sources, to fund the war effort. There was no lend-lease, there's no direct economic aid coming from places like the United States. Instead, there's an enormous amount of borrowing. The government borrows from British banks borrow from American banks to meet the demand, to fulfill this sort of patriotic duty. At the end of the war, the Americans want their money back instantly. And the British are going to scramble. We'll talk about this more later on. But one of the results of this is this sort of loss of financial status for Britain is that London ceases to be the sort of financial center of the world, or the financial capital of the world. Before 1914, if you were an international investor, if you were wealthy, if you managed a lot of money, you tended to want to keep it in London. You put it in London banks. You invested it with London firms. You kept everything in pounds, or a lot of stuff in pounds, because the pound was seen to be the international currency, the strongest currency in the world. Once Britain is the largest debtor nation in the world, people start worrying about the pound. And over the course of the 1920s, more and more people begin to shift their savings, their investment, their financial interests to New York. They want to hold their investments, hold their savings in dollars. Those are seen as stronger. During the 1920s, the British government is going to engage in some really foolhardy efforts to try to rescue the pound. Not all of which, or very few of which, in fact, will actually work. But the amount of money that the City of London creates for the larger British economy declines because of the fact that New York becomes a much more attractive financial capital. After the Depression hits, London will start to regain some importance because the City of London's finances will be in a little bit better shape than those, for example, in New York. But there's a couple other things for Britain. Britain was, before the war, the world's largest manufacturer. They exported more manufactured goods than any other country in the world. After the war, they are still in the top 3 in terms of exports, but they are losing ground rapidly. In the 1920s and the 1930s, the British are going to find it very hard to re-engage with markets that existed before the war. In places like Asia and Latin America, what the British will discover is that there's been a pattern of import substitution. That is, countries that used to import goods made in Britain, which they couldn't get during the war, because British industry was concentrated on the war effort, transport was concentrated on the war effort, they started to make their own, or they started to get it from somewhere else. In the case of Latin America, you have, in places like Argentina and Brazil, the creation of their own steel and engineering industries. You have, in India, the expansion of domestic textile production. You have, in particular, Japan. Because the Japanese economy was not nearly on the war footing that the European economies were, the Japanese are very well placed in the early 1920s to make huge inroads into existing British markets and begin to undersell British goods, especially in places like India. You also have the fact that, in the Western Hemisphere, not only do you have countries creating their own economic infrastructure, you also have the United States after the war, rather rapidly exporting consumer goods, automobiles, washing machines, things like that, to places like Mexico and other parts of Central and South America. You've got in Britain, as elsewhere in Europe and even in the United States, significant post-war unemployment. You have lots of demobilized soldiers. You have war industries which are no longer required, huge labor populations or huge labor forces. And you don't have the immediate prospect of exporting manufactured goods to the rest of the world. There's not a lot of sort of consumer demand out there in the world right at the end of the war. So you've got millions unemployed. This is the case in Germany, in France, the United States, Britain, and Italy. In Italy, in particular, the unemployment crisis is so bad that by 1922, Mussolini is in charge. So you've got post-war unemployment, which is powerful in Britain. It's going to be powerful throughout the rest of the world, or at least the major powers that fought the war. You have, in Germany, economic crisis brought on not only because the war destroys infrastructure, the war destroys part of the labor force, the war reorients the direction in which industry is going, but also, at the end of the war, the British and the French are going to make the Germans, we'll talk more about this later, but they're going to make the Germans pay what's called reparations. Basically pay back huge fines and penalties for having started the war. Having started the war and then lost the war. And they're going to demand these in cash. The British and the French will demand that the Germans pay them in cash. Because the British and the French need to pay their own creditors, many of whom are American banks. The result is that the German economy, for the first half of the 1920s, is very squeezed. The economist, the famous economist, perhaps the most famous economist of the 20th century, John Maynard Keynes, is a member of the British delegation at the Versailles Peace Conference in 1919. He quits and writes a pamphlet called The Economic Consequences of the Peace, in which he says that reparations are a terrible idea. He says the reparations are going to do a couple of things. They're going to force the German government to borrow heavily from German banks. That turns out to be true. To borrow cash. All of that cash to be shipped out to Britain and France. He says that means that there's going to be no money in the banks for anyone who needs a loan, who needs credit, who wants to buy something, whether a consumer good, an industrial good. He says, Germany's not going to work. No one in Germany, the German economy is not going to get started. There'll be no credit. There'll be no money available for it. And if the German economy doesn't get started, the French and the British economies won't get started either. And what happens is almost exactly as Keynes had forecast. Keynes is one of these very annoying people in the 20th century because he's just about always right. And he's also never reluctant to tell people that he's right. But he was the treasurer of his the college at Cambridge University where he was on faculty and made them unbelievable amounts of money in the stock market in the 1920s. And then got out in time, so again, people hated him for that too. But you have this very significant book in which points out basically what happens in Germany. The German government borrows enormously. There's no money left in the German economy for anyone else. So the Germans decide what they're going to do in 1922 and 1923 is that they're going to start printing more money to make it available to consumers. That you will basically give people new access to funds to jumpstart the economy. People can borrow, people can buy things, people can arrange credit. The problem is not only do they decide to do this, they just decide, well, if we're going to put a little bit of money in, we might as well put a lot in. And they create what's known as hyperinflation. What you can see here is a woman actually, literally, burning bundles of banknotes in 1923. Because, in fact, the amount of money required to purchase coal was so great that actually you would get more benefit if you just actually burnt the money. That is, the amount of coal you could get for a certain amount of cash, the cash would burn longer. So why even go buy the coal? And you had pictures of people bringing wheelbarrows of money to the store to buy bread. It's something like, when I think about the number of marks that were placed in circulation, because they kept doing this, because they kept saying, and you got into this sort of cycle, where once they started, there was this huge demand for money, prices go, people could buy things for the first time, people had the money kept coming, prices skyrocketed. It was something like the number of German marks in circulation internally in Germany, something like, take the numbers 423 and then add 27 zeros behind it. And that's, I don't even know exactly what that number is called. We call it a lot. And the German economy goes from sort of stagnation to hyperinflation almost overnight, which doesn't improve things either. Only in 1924 will the world get together and basically say, we need to find a way to get the Germans out of this predicament. I'll talk more about that when we talk about Germany specifically. But so here, the war is seen for the Germans because, of course, their culpability in the war, but for the British, for others, the war is seen as an economic dislocation. The war has produced massive unemployment. It's produced a loss of export markets. It's produced a declined position or a reduced position for Britain as a sort of a world capital center. And this all goes back to this: the idea that anything that produces instability ultimately may produce revolution. So war is bad economically. War is bad potentially politically. We haven't talked about the fact that war creates all these new states. The breakup of these empires, like the Austro-Hungarian Empire. All of these states are going to experiment to one degree or another with democracy in the 1920s and early 1930s. And in many of these states, people are going to give up on democracy because it'll turn out to be very messy. And the specter will loom again that if democracy is messy, you need something perhaps more authoritarian, so that you don't get the Bolsheviks, or some equivalent to the Bolsheviks, emerging in Hungary, or Poland, or Yugoslavia. So again, political dislocation, economic dislocation. One other thing I just should stress is that the war creates significant challenges for empires that managed to ride out the war, in particular for the British and French empires. In the first place, during the war, the British and the French both took advantage of the defeat of the Ottoman Empire to take over parts of the Middle East, with rather devastating results. It's the British who create what is now modern Iraq. The French have Syria, the French have Lebanon, the British have Jordan, and the British control what's called the Palestine territory for about 20 years. For about 30 years. None of which goes very well for the British. that is, that territory accumulated from this war does not seem to pay off as previous sort of imperial expansions had. The other thing is this, and this is very concerning for the British, is that a war fought in the name of self-determination against German aggression. A war fought to ultimately bring, in Woodrow Wilson's words, to bring self-determination, to bring the rights of national communities, to establish their own states. This is very troublesome for the British Empire, in particular, because the rhetoric of the war, the rhetoric of protecting or nurturing democracy, nurturing civil liberty, that all runs right up against the fact that the British still control this massive empire. And the war is going to produce a couple of things. In the first place, this is a world war for many reasons, one of which is that it's fought by countries that are empires. Britain, France, Italy, the Germans, all have significant empire or imperial possessions outside of Europe. People who live in those possessions fight in the war, whether they're fighting in Europe, in the Middle East, or elsewhere. They rally to the cause, whether it's Australians, Indians, Chinese from Hong Kong, East Africans from British-controlled Kenya. They all rise to this challenge. Or they all rise, you might say, to the occasion, in one way or another, and come fight for Britain, just as people from Senegal and Algeria and Morocco will fight for France. But the rhetoric of the war doesn't quite match up to many of these people's circumstances. And after the war, for example, in India, people like M.K. Gandhi will push for greater Indian self-rule, in part based on the sacrifices that Indians had made for Britain. That Britain had fought this war to make the world safe for democracy or safe for self-determination, but they were denying that in India. It gives Indian nationalists like Gandhi a real way to push on the British administration in India. In the middle of the war in 1916, there's actually an uprising in Ireland against Britain, or against continued British control in Ireland. It's a failure, but one which the British completely mishandle into such a way as to make the people who are the revolutionaries into martyrs. At the end of the war, basically, the southern two-thirds of Ireland declares its independence from the British Isles. Places like Australia and Canada and New Zealand, which had enjoyed, or did enjoy, self-government, they, at the end of the war, they begin to assert their separation from Britain even more strongly as well. One element in this, and that's very important for especially Australia, the First World War fundamentally changes the relationship between Australia and Britain. And it has a lot to do with a place in southern Turkey called Gallipoli, G-A-L-L-I-P-O-L-I. Anyone ever seen the film Gallipoli? What? Mel Gibson. It's the one Mel Gibson movie you watched. No, there's another. The Year of Living Dangerously, about the Indonesian, by Indonesian independence. Everything else, no. But see, that's easy to remember. Gallipoli is this place in southern Turkey which the British were determined to take in early 1915, May 1915, to push against the Ottomans and try and drive them out of the war quickly. It winds up being this massive catastrophe. That is, soldiers are landed on these unprotected beaches. The Turks have, or the Ottoman army has artillery positioned on cliffs above them. They can rain fire down on them. You have thousands of Australian troops in particular basically besieged on these beaches. The Australians feel that the British Royal Navy deposited them there and then moved well out of range to protect their ships, but so far out of range that they couldn't provide any covering fire for the Australians. People die of their wounds. People die of things like cholera and fever that were rampant for these. And there's a real sentiment in Australia during and after the war that the Australians have been treated like second-class citizens. Australia had been, before the war, a very, very pro-British place, a very, very sort of Anglophile place. Kind of strange when you think about, the fact that many of the, the people who originally populated, or many of the original sort of non-indigenous people who populated Australia went there involuntarily. You have, by the early 20th century, a very sort of pronounced Anglophilia, sort of more British than the British. That changes utterly during the First World War. That is, the Australians have, in May now, their own commemoration called Anzac Day, the Australia-New Zealand Army Corps. They commemorate that day to commemorate what happened in Gallipoli, or they use that day to commemorate what happened in Gallipoli.
Wasn't Gallipoli Churchill's first?
It was Churchill's idea, and he resigned right afterwards. There's a story that in 1939 he's brought back into the British government when the war begins, and he goes back to his old office at the naval. He goes back to his old sort of place at the naval office, and he opens it up, and there's still a map of Gallipoli on the wall. I'm not entirely sure. I think they cleaned more of it than that. But yeah, Gallipoli is sort of Churchill's downfall. He's sort of in disgrace as the man who planned it, or the man who was the great sort of champion of it. But the Australians take it very personal. And after the First World War, relations between Australia and Britain are never the same, or never resemble what they were like before the war. There's a much greater insistence on a separate Australian identity. We tend not to think of this, but it's going to have a big effect in the Second World War. When the British and the Australians in 1940, 41, early 1942 are going to be tasked with protecting British possessions in Southeast Asia, one enormous problem is going to be the Australians and the British military. They hate each other. And the British in particular are going to take every opportunity to blame the Australians for things that go wrong. Largely by saying, well, we meant to do this, but the Australians were drunk. We tried to do this, but the Australians were drunk. That sort of becomes a repetitive thing. The Australians' response at times was, well, you already surrendered, so of course we got drunk. This did nothing to enhance sort of relations between them. But again, it is a really dramatic turn. So even though Britain has this enormous empire that survives the war, you've got real challenges to it in the fact that they're trying to govern places in the Middle East where they're absolutely not welcome. For example, a place like Palestine. That they are challenged because the rhetoric and the used in the war, the contributions made in the war by constituent parts of the empire are now turned against the British. That is, there's an Indian delegation to the Versailles Peace Conference in 1919. They're sort of given a separate delegation, but they're not given much sort of preeminence or much of a position at the conference itself. But the idea is, well, why are we here? And why are we here at this conference designed to enshrine Woodrow Wilson's principles and talk about self-determination if we can't even vote? If we can't even have our own legislature, even with restricted powers? So this war leaves people, in Europe in particular, with discomfort about war. Whether discomfort about the physical and psychological injuries, about the massive loss of life, with concerns that war is socially and politically dislocating, that war is economically harmful, and that all of these things could lead potentially to social revolution, political and socioeconomic upheaval. The First World War really is going to shape how, in Europe in particular, and to a lesser degree in the United States, how people will react to what's coming in Europe and in the world generally from the late 1920s on. That is, the First World War creates this real hesitance, or this real sort of hesitation about conflict, whether on a sort of ethical and moral level or on a pragmatic, political, or economic level. We'll start to talk next week about how the war plays out, or the impact of the war plays out in the 20s and 30s in some specific areas. Talk about the Germans, the Soviets, the Japanese, and then the British and the Americans. All right, I will see you all on Tuesday. Thank you.
Good to see you.